That was dramatic, wasn't it? It's going to happen. Hello, welcome, good evening. Are you all right? Terrified. It's quite bright, isn't it? I did ask them if they had any sexy mood lighting, and they said, it's a university, no. And I went, fine, okay. Welcome, thank you so much for coming. Everyone, live human beings in the room, and I've been told that there's 10,000 to 12,000 people watching at home. I might have exaggerated that number. So welcome, hello people at home. Very quick, before I introduce our main guest, safety. There was a safety, yeah, there it still is. But should the alarms go off, do not panic, but do leave by the nearest exit, which is just there, and our stewards will help you out of the building. But that's, hey, no, there's a lady there pointing at that door that says exit, and that does feel nearer than that, doesn't it? But this says nearest exit, and I went, so that one, and they went, that one. And I was like, right, okay, but there we are. So let's leave by that. I think what we should all take away is don't leave by the furthest exit if the alarm goes off. And people watching at home, if your home alarm goes off, I imagine you have your own procedure. What else? Oh, yeah, questions. So we want this to be interactive. So if you have any questions, launch your arm up into the air. And if you're watching at home, then you can do something with Zoom that makes it pop up on my screen, and then we can go from there. But it's good, especially if you're watching at home, to get your questions in as quick as you can, and then we've got them stacked up there. It's up to you, really. See when it occurs to you. Is that all the things? Can you also please put your mobile phones on silent for this session? Tick. Right. Is that it? Oh, God, I haven't even checked mine. I'm sure it is fine. Right, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Hayley Campbell.
Hello.
How terrified are you?
Slightly. I should point out that I do know this man, and he is my boyfriend, and I have no idea how this is going to go, because...
I prepared these questions, and I've always wanted to do a proper interview, because I'm a big fan of, you know, like, Crossfire and Hardball and things. So I've been writing down the most probing, searing, difficult questions. No, I'm sure these will be fine. Otherwise, it'll be a really awkward car ride home. Let's find out. Has anyone read this book or seen this book? Put up your hands if you've read it. You've read it. One reader. Well done. Excellent. So this is what we'll be talking about. This is, well, let's start off with, give a little précis of the book.
Well, it's basically me going around speaking to people who work with dead bodies and asking them why they chose that job and how they do it. And in most of the instances, I asked them to show me. So I was in morgues, and I was in a graveyard with the gravediggers, in the muddiest van I've ever seen. And it's just talking to people who don't normally get asked about their jobs because nobody wants to know. And so mostly when I first met them, they said, why? Why do you want to talk to me? So
that is a good question. I should have had that.
Yeah, it's people who work with dead bodies and why they do what they do and what it says about us by the fact that they exist.
Well, let me start with a new question I've just written. Why? Why death? And what made you want to read this book?
Why not death?
Read this book. Write this book even.
Why not death? Death is fascinating, and I've always thought so. When I was I went to Catholic school when I was a kid, and I had all of these questions about death, and no one ever answered me properly or as seriously as I wanted to be answered. You know, you ask the priest, and he would tell you about heaven, and I was like, that doesn't really talk about what happens to the bodies when they go under the ground. But when you're a kid and you ask these questions, they think you're a weirdo. And I didn't think that was the case. I was like, but that happens. It felt like I was being the practical one and everyone else was bullshitting me. And so that's...
Catholic school sounds great. You touch on it in the first chapter, but how weird a child were you? Because this isn't like, you know, to write a book about death. It's not the first thing you'd think about.
No. You've definitely met little weird kids, but I don't think they're weird. Other people did, my teachers mostly. But when I was growing up, well, he still is my dad, but my dad is Hayley Campbell, who did a book called From Hell with Alan Moore, which is about the Jack the Ripper murders. And so at around, I think he started it when I was little, maybe 3 or something, but he finished it when I was about 13. So it took years. And so for the whole time that you're forming your personality and becoming a little person, I was surrounded by autopsy pictures. I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of the Jack the Ripper victims, but they are graphic. And they're in black and white, obviously, but they're inky and horrible. But he would have them pinned up on his drawing board, and they never frightened me. I just wanted to know who she was and what happened to her body next, who was looking after her, and all. You know, I was just fascinated by the fact that this was happening. But the problem with having a dad who is an artist drawing these, who is also Scottish and quite tight with paper, meant that he would be doing drawings, and he would never throw out a piece of paper. If there was a blank back on the paper, that went into the recycling pile. So whenever I was doing my homework, I would just take a piece of paper and do my maths on the back of it, which meant that my teachers were frequently handed pictures of disemboweled prostitutes by an 8-year-old. And they would call my parents and say, this is inappropriate. And they would ask me, like, why have you handed me this drawing? It's horrible. And I'd say, it's just prostitutes, just dead prostitutes. And I couldn't see why they had a problem with something that had happened in the past and was factual. Mainly made for very, very interesting parent-teacher interviews.
Yeah. When we said to Hayley for her to show us her working, we didn't expect this. I've read a few death books, and this seems very different. Can you explain how and why this book is different from other death books?
I've read every death book there is, and there are different kinds. They're mostly about dying, or they're about grief. And the dying ones can be sad cancer memoirs, same with grief. There's also the academic kind, which can be very dry and focuses more on the philosophical idea of death. Whereas I wanted to focus not on dying or grief, but the bit in the middle where there are dead bodies, because people tend to forget about that. The person dies and then they're taken away, and you move on to grief, and that's where you move on to the second kind of book. There are books out there by people who do these jobs, like Caitlin Doty's Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is great, and Sue Black wrote a great one as well. But there wasn't a book that covered all of the jobs that I could see. There was one written in the 80s by Michael Lessie called The Forbidden Zone, and it's really good, and if you ever find it, do read it. I was quite annoyed when I first found it, because I thought someone else had done what I wanted to do, but his version is very 80s, especially in the way he talks about homosexuality and AIDS, and it's very male. And in my experience of people working in the death industry, it's overwhelmingly female. I've been writing about the death industry, or people working around it, for about 10 years, so I thought I wanted to talk to those people, and they hadn't been covered in a way I wanted them to be covered. Had they been covered already, I would have eaten that book up and I would have written something else, but this is different, I think.
So still get Lessie's book, but maybe
Lessie's
skip to
book is great. Just
Sounds like it's got some
bit
interesting
weird.
views. Right. So how did you, if you...
But, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker is
Yeah.
also a great book. But there is a weird chapter in the middle about how homosexuality is a mental illness. Skip that bit as well, and the rest is good.
How did you choose the people you interview? How did you, find them? Because a lot of them are jobs that I didn't even know were out there. So how did you find them, and how did you pick which ones?
Well, you've seen my big murder board. I got a big pin board. And I figured out when a person dies, all the stages their body goes through, who takes it where. So I wanted to look at the body as it goes from its deathbed to burial or cremation, and all the people who interact with it along the way. And so when you do that, you've got the funeral director, you've got the autopsy technicians, you've got embalmers. And so once I'd figured all of that out, I thought I had way too many people. And then it was just down to who would talk to me. And most people wouldn't, because people who work in the death industry don't want to talk to journalists. And I do not blame them, because they have been made out to be ghoulish and cartoonish and just weirdos.
Deceitful and untrustworthy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of just Piers Morgan, but yeah.
Nobody wants to talk to them. So I had to do a lot of begging and a lot of getting this person to vouch for me, for that person. There was a lot of character reference. And this book took so long to write, mostly because, I was trying to prove myself that I wasn't out to write something, sensationalistic and horrible. And even when you say those words and you say, I know the things that you don't want me to write, people don't believe you. So it took ages.
You said that you have been writing about death for more than 10 years. What other things have you written about, and what was the death things as well?
There was a strange festival held in Winchester called the Ideal Death Show. And I went for a jolly because I worked for BuzzFeed at the time, and I thought I could get out of the office. And it was just like a convention of people who work in the death industry. So you could go and get measured for your coffin. There was a nice man with a lisp who was measuring people for shrouds. And
fancy a shroud.
And it was just fun. And I found that people who work in the funeral industry are really fun in the pub, because they have seen the worst thing that can happen, and they've made peace with it. Being in the pub with actors is far worse than being in the pub with embalmers. They are fun. Who knew?
Is it peace or is it trauma? And they're just drinking through that, and they're fun to be around with this.
Who knows? But I also wrote about a new method of body disposal called alkaline hydrolysis for Wired magazine, which is this silver tunnel that is filled with superheated water and lye. And the body goes in, and they call it water cremation. The body goes in, and basically all meat and anything biological dissolves except for the skeleton. And what's left is this white, chalky skeleton, and they blend that in the bone blender. And what you're left with is what you're left with in the case of normal cremation, except normal cremation can tend to look like cat litter. It's quite gray. And alkaline hydrolysis, you end up with a bag that looks like cocaine. And it's slowly gaining ground. It was recently made legal in California. And
cocaine?
But it's not here yet, despite the fact that the machines are made in Leeds.
Oh.
I went to the factory, and they make the machines and they export them to America. And it's what a few medical schools use to dispose of their cadavers. And I think it's an amazing machine, and I think it's really sad we don't have it here. But we don't have it here because people are frightened, and because journalists, people who have my job, have written horrible things about it in the newspapers, about, dissolving bodies means mints in the sewers or something. And that is not what happens, because when the body dissolves, it makes a sort of tea liquid. It's just the color of tea, and it's just the broken down pieces of the body. So it's all DNA and various acids and chemicals. It's not mince.
And where does that go? Straight down the...
That goes down the drain, but that's,
Right.
you know, that can be fertilizer for farmers and things. It's sterile. It's not gross.
Okay.
It sounds gross.
I'm just thinking of the sound of the flush when you lose your nan. That's based in Leeds. They're made in Leeds, but we're in York. How do you feel about Leeds? Is there friendly? No rivalry? Right, okay. I didn't know if you were like, well, if they're liquefying them, we're going to burn them. It's like, you have like a city off.
When I went to the factory, the guy it's a family-run factory, and the guy who ran it said that his dad was super interested in alkaline hydrolysis. He loved this idea. He loved being part of a new thing, because, you can add... Burial and cremation have been around for decades. He was excited that their factory was going to be part of this new thing. And then he died before it was made legal, because it's still not legal. And I asked, this is an example of, what happens when you're a little weird kid and you grow up. I asked the guy who runs the factory, didn't you just dissolve your dad anyway? And he said he hadn't thought of it. Would you have done it? As his last wish, would you have dissolved your dad?
If he was dead? Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
You didn't think of it. But the mood turned in the interview after that.
Well, it's because he was thinking about his dad. And given it is Father's Day, maybe if you're still yet to buy your father a gift, a nice big bag of lime from B&Q. We've just had someone, Anna Hunter, has just come in saying that woolen coffins are also made in Leeds.
Wow. What's going on in Leeds?
So they're big on death. I don't know is woolen the brand make, or is it actually woolen as in they're made out of wool? Woolen coffins.
Do you know?
Anna, can you tell us? They're actually made out of wool.
Oh, wow.
Right, well, I was going to come up... That's interesting, because later in the book you go to a crematorium, and I was going to ask you about that, because the crematorium operator talks about eco-friendly... They are made out of wool, says Anna. They are amazing. Sounds like Anna's tried a few. They're not itchy. So you spoke to a crematorium operator, and I was going to touch on this, actually, but it now feels like the right time. Anna says, I haven't tried them yet. Saving that. But there was an interesting thing you found out about eco-coffins, wasn't it? And I wonder if it's the same with wool.
So eco-coffins and cardboard coffins, everyone loves the idea of doing something good for the environment, and everybody should. But when cardboard coffins first came onto the market, nobody thought about how they would get from the trolley that moves them around the crematorium to the actual oven. And the crematorium I went to, and these places are all, there are differences among everybody, so I can't speak for all crematoriums. But in this one, the way they got the coffin into the oven was they pushed it. They charged the coffin, so much so that the operator I spoke to had one really big arm. He had one Popeye arm, and the other one was sort of withered. And he had to run and push with all his weight to get this coffin to go, and it made this roar as it rolled across the trolley and into this oven, which was, it was like the surface of the moon. It was all raggedy and old because it's just a brick thing with fire in it. But when the first cardboard coffins arrived, nobody thought about that. So they would start pushing it, and then the coffin would start disintegrating as it got its nose in. And then it would buckle, because there was no heavy board, because a wooden coffin has this heavy board on the bottom. So it's not going to buckle or crumple. Cardboard coffins would crumple. So then and it would go on fire, and it would start taking in the whole coffin.
Imagine it combust before it got in there.
Yeah, before the person got in there. So then they're pushing the body in while the coffin is disappearing around them. And the guy I spoke to was horrified by this because he was kind of grossed out by the idea of dead bodies. Even though all day he is pushing them into the crematorium, he thinks the idea of touching dead bodies is gross. He says it's spooky. And so he really didn't like this. But there's now regulations in coffin making, and they have to come with a heavy board, which helps charge them. But it was an interesting example of people not speaking to other people in other departments and not thinking about what this new nice thing for the environment actually means for the guy downstairs in the basement.
I wonder if the people who make woolen coffins have spoken to anyone.
That's what I was thinking. Is it like a baggie, or does it have...
A baggie. Drop them in from above.
Yeah.
All of them have wooden boards now, do they? Mm-hmm. I imagine. So there we are.
There were lots of interesting leaflets I've picked up at various funeral conventions I've been to with like little, the little kind of men when you had Word in the 90s, and there were little like stick men with showing you things, and they had little cartoon men pushing this coffin that just concertinaed, and then they were looking sad.
The guys in the IKEA thing when you're trying to make it. And one's like, the other one's on the phone. Got another body. So what are the other jobs he explored? Because let's have a little dash through them. What are the other types of jobs in the death trade?
I spoke to a funeral director who, she invited me into her mortuary to help dress a dead body, which when I told the crematorium operator about that later, he was he pulled a face. But Poppy Mardle, she's a funeral director in South London, and I met her at a wake for a long-dead philosopher called Jeremy Bentham at UCL. And she had stood up and given a speech about her job. And she was in her early to mid-30s at the time, and she said that she wished she could bring children into her mortuary to show them death before they had to see it, because she thinks that we should be able to separate the shock of seeing dead people for the first time from the shock of losing someone you love. And it really got to me. She said, the first dead body you see should not be someone you love. And I don't really remember the rest of the night because I was thinking about that. And the next day I emailed her and said, I loved what you said, and I've been thinking about it, and can I come and see you? So I interviewed her about her job and about this funeral home that she runs in the middle of this cemetery in South London. She's converted this dilapidated chapel, so it's really nice. It's pretty. And I hadn't seen a dead body before, so I basically asked her, can I see one? And I felt a bit gross asking, but I thought I'd try my luck. And she said, it's not a museum, and we're not just getting people out for you to look at, but you can come back and help get someone ready for their funeral. And I thought that was amazing, and I was slightly, anxious about it. But I went back, and it was an amazing moment. I didn't know this man, and I helped get him dressed, and I put him in his coffin, and it was amazing. And that kind of set the tone for the book, because I think this book could have easily been me writing about wanting to see dead people and be around dead bodies, and then ending with me dressing a dead body for his funeral. But to start with that and then go from there made it a different book. It would have been a different book if I hadn't met Poppy, I don't think.
Right. You could have ended it on your first chapter.
Yeah.
It would have been way less stressful to write.
But then from there, I went from seeing one dead body to hundreds. I went to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, which is this amazing medical place where it's very inventive and experimental. They do face transplants there. And I spoke to the guy who signs you up to donate your body, and then he takes your body in when you die, and he embalms you, he freezes you, he might petition you, so your arms are on that shelf and your legs are down there. He was really nice. And I spoke to the death mask maker, who's a guy called Nick Reynolds, who's actually, he's in the band Alabama 3, who do the theme song for The Sopranos. So you would have heard him. He plays the harmonica. But when he's not touring with his band, he is the only guy who's he's commercially doing death masks in the UK. So if somebody dies, you can get a cast made of their dead face to take home. Some people go, why would you want that? But having seen them, I can completely understand. They're kind of magical. And he showed me them in his house. He has a death mask of his father, and he has one of Ronnie Biggs, because his father is one of the great train robbery guys, Bruce Reynolds. So he has I was talking to him going, that's interesting, that's interesting. This sounds like I'm making this man up now. But he is real.
He also did a death mask of a certain politician's father.
Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad. He did him.
I imagine that just looks like a Play-Doh impression of Jacob Rees-Mogg. It'd look the same, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't get to see that one. He says he doesn't keep them, other people's.
Right, like copies of them.
He'll keep copies of famous people that he does, but he did Peter O'Toole as well. When I was sitting on the sofa, there was a cast of Peter O'Toole's hand, which was massive, and I didn't know Peter O'Toole had massive hands, but I felt dwarfed by them.
It's the Irish lankiness. You say in the book, there was what's that episode in the book with Nick Reynolds, and he had to do a death mask on the fly?
Nick Reynolds is very political, and he's mostly political about capital punishment. And he met somebody who was friends with someone who was about to be executed, and he believed him to be innocent. He heard all of the evidence against this guy, and he said it was nonsense. And so he wanted to do something with his art to show the world what was happening. And he wanted to get a death mask of this man made soon after he had been killed. And he wanted to also get a cast of his arm and have 3 hypodermic needles coming out of the vein, and then tour that on one of his shows. And he did do that, but much like me turning up at mortuaries asking to speak to people, he turned up at the jail and said, can we come in and do a cast of the body? And they said, absolutely not. What do you think you're doing? And so they had to kidnap the body in a rental car and drive it.
I wouldn't use my own car. I would definitely use a rental car.
And
just a dog rug on the back would not be sufficient.
A big tarp.
Yeah.
And they had to drive it to this little shack in Texas. And he said it was a bit like the one in Friday the 13th. But it was, the body was still warm when he was doing it because it was straight after he had been killed. So his wife was in the back of the car holding this man's hand, and it was the first time he'd been touched in something like 12 years. But because he was still warm, when they did a cast of his face, and to do that, you use the kind of blue stuff that dentists use when they get a cast of your teeth, so it's cold. He put it over the guy's face, waved that to harden, and took it off, and he made a cast of it later. But he noticed that the guy had goosebumps on his skin because of the temperature of this blue dental alginate. And he hadn't expected that because he hadn't done a death mask of someone that recently dead ever before. Because when people usually call the death mask guy, and it's very rare anyway, but when they do, the person's usually been in the fridge for about 5 weeks. They've got the kind of shrunken look that bodies get in the fridge, and he has to change them a bit. But he didn't have to change this guy's face at all, and he left the goosebumps there. And he had the death mask in the room with us, and I touched it. It was really magical. It does feel like there's something in there, even though it's just a cast of a face.
Just to clear up the word kidnapping, just because I remember this is going out live. Technically, well, they'd released the body, hadn't they? They'd signed a release saying that they were taking it straight to
Right, so
funeral?
basically they lied and pretended that they had another location to take the body to. They pretended they had a funeral director waiting for them, and they didn't. So they had a body in a car. And no real plan beyond that, other than
That would
taking it to
be
Shaq.
an interesting traffic stop, wouldn't it? What are the other characters you've met? It's quite a diverse bunch. You've met a... Well, come on, you take us through.
Who comes after Nick?
Who comes after Nick? I'll tell you who comes after Nick. Good grief, we're only at chapter 3. How long we got? We've got... Oh, Limbo.
Limbo. That was about so when a mass fatality incident happens, like a plane crashes or a train crashes or anything horrible and huge, I hadn't thought about the practicalities of what happens next. And there's a company called Kenyon who kind of they assume the name of whichever company it was who had the mass accident. So if it's EasyJet, they'll pretend they're EasyJet. But they're essentially like a super team of people who come in and pick up all the pieces of bodies, identify people, send them back to whichever country they're from. And they're also a team of people who find personal effects. Everything you had with you when the plane went down, whether it's an Ian Rankin book or your glasses or, a teddy bear, they find them and they take them back to their warehouse in North London, and they find who owns them and they try and return them. You can say you don't want them back, but they take care of the things that the police don't care about, because personal effects to police aren't a major thing. But Kenyon sees that as massively important. And also, they're collecting pieces of people that might be no bigger than an orange, and they're making sure that person gets home to their family. Meeting that whole team of people, and Mo, who's the guy I spoke to the most, I hadn't really thought about why it's important to get a small piece of the body back. It's like proof that this person existed and they are gone. But I researched around that idea and found this whole history, and I felt stupid for not knowing about it, but in Spain they've got something called the Pact of Forgetting. So everybody who was killed under General Franco's rule, you're not, you as a family now are not allowed to try and find them in the mass graves, because when Franco went away, Spain basically decided, let's not do what Germany did. Let's not put everyone on trial and make museums out of the concentration camps. Let's just forget everything happened. And it's strange because streets still bear these people's names. But I found that there are loads of old women, mostly, who are campaigning to try and find their father's bones. They have these vague rumors of where their dad was last seen, and he was last seen being marched here and maybe shot against this wall. And it really made me think about how important it is, the body, how important it is to have that at the funeral, because there are lots of, sometimes people talk about, in that death convention I went to, the Ideal Death Show in Winchester, someone there gave quite a cheeky speech about why do we need a body at a funeral? Like, what does it even mean? And he was trying to get a rise out of everyone there, because everyone there was responsible for the body being at the funeral. But his talk kept coming back to me, because it's not quite closure. People use that word, but I was told by a woman who lost her husband in a plane crash that closure is just an insurance company word. And mass death events, things like a plane crash, you never get closure on that. The crash never ends. And so you will never get that thing. But there's something that you do get when you get this small piece of body back. And it's incredibly important to many, many people. And this company is doing that, and they're identifying these small pieces. And when these people have their funerals, they have full-size coffins, and then inside them is just like a sample pot sometimes. I was being shown pictures of the body parts as they were being released, because Mo, who I interviewed in the book, he goes to the release of the bodies to make sure that everything is signed off, and he's there for all of them.
Some places don't allow, is it, people to always view the bodies because they think it would be too gruesome or disturbing?
Yeah.
So what's the rules around that?
Well, there are new rules now because you might have heard of the Marchioness disaster, the boat that sank on the Thames, and it was a party boat, and lots of people died, and most of them were under the age of 30. And basically, that was a huge disaster, because what they did was in order to identify the bodies, they were using these mass death tactics, like when they were using the small death tactics for this mass thing. So Mo, who I spoke to, said that sometimes to identify people, they'll use their hands, and they'll take them from the mortuary, just take the hand to a place where they can get fingerprints. And that's all right.
It's often done with homeless people,
It's
isn't
often
it?
done with homeless people. And he said it was the kind of people who would have a police file anyway. So there was some, reasoning behind going and getting them fingerprinted and identified that way. But when this boat sank and it was just kids, and most of them didn't have police files, it just meant that suddenly lots of kids didn't have hands. And so there were handless bodies, and there were parents who wanted to see these kids and say goodbye, and the police were saying, no, you can't see them like this, you can't, it will just upset you. And that upset parents more. I read the entire report of the inquest, and it was just parent after parent saying, the fact that I was denied seeing this person has meant that my grief is, it hasn't had the proper staging posts that grieving does, because that huge chunk was missing. But some of them who did see the bodies, who insisted, went in and found them handless. It's just
That's right.
disaster after they hadn't told them, they hadn't warned them, they hadn't said why they did things, and it was just disaster after disaster. So now there are new rules in place for what people can expect and what families should be offered. And basically, if you as a family member want to see your dead person, you are allowed, and it doesn't matter what state it's in. It doesn't matter, the person can't choose for you and say it is too decomposed, it'll just upset you. No one can choose for you. And in fact, Poppy, when I met her, she said that a guy had come to her, having spoken to loads and loads of funeral directors, and said, no one will let me see my brother, because he had drowned and he'd been in the water for so long that, water changes the body. You bloat, skin kind of peels, and you turn very white. Even if your skin is dark, you turn white. And funeral directors had said to him, you can't see him. And so he came to her and he said, will you let me see my brother? And that was basically all he wanted. And she said, of course, because he's your brother and you can do whatever you like. And then he chose her and he did get to see his brother. But it made me really angry that there are people out there forcing their limits on other people. And I think it's a very personal thing. And part of what I wanted to do with the book was show you what to expect, and show you that most of the things that I've seen in here you can do yourself. They won't let you into the autopsy, but I wouldn't recommend going. But if you wanted to be there in the crematorium, when they charge it in, you can be there. If you want to be there with the gravediggers, you can do that. You can dress a dead person if you want to, and I would recommend it. But it made me really angry to know that there are people out there saying you cannot do this, you cannot do that. Some claiming it's a legal thing. We don't allow it. There's no legal limit against you seeing your dead person. I think that was the point of the book.
I'm going to look at every dead body I can. When you were in Kenya, you went round, you were being showed by Mo around all the different artifacts and things that they had collected. Well, you were talking about airplane crashes at the time, and then suddenly you found yourself among a lot of ceiling-high railings with lots of belongings on, and then he just dropped a bombshell. What was it?
Those were all of the personal effects from Grenfell. So after the people had been cleared out of the building and after the fire had been put out, the workers from Kenyon went in and collected everything. And it was coins, it was clothing, it was baby baskets and, children's seats, bicycles, and all sorts of things. Everything that makes up a normal person's life was all packaged up at this burnt-out building and brought back to Kenyon. And I visited them in 2019, which was 2 years after the fire, and they were still sorting through every little piece and trying to find who it belonged to and if they wanted it back. And some people didn't want it back, and if they didn't want it back, they smashed it to pieces and made it completely unidentifiable in the back of the warehouse. But what I loved was one of the Kenyan workers found this tank of fish in Grenfell. So in this skeletal, burned-out building, he found a tank of fish. And most of them were dead. But there were a couple in there. And so they found who owned these fish. And the people said, we can't take them in our new temporary house. We can't keep them. And so this Kenyan worker took the 2 fish home, and they bred, and they had a baby fish, and he called it Phoenix. And I thought that was the most unlikely story to hear, just in a warehouse of burned stuff.
A little wet fish called Phoenix. Amanda Capello has come in with, I've been eyeing up this question, and I thought I'll use this when we need to pick the mood up a bit. What is your most joyful moment from writing this book? Brackets, other than finishing it. So I'm guessing Amanda has experience with writing or deadlines.
Probably sitting in the van with the gravediggers and eating the wine gums. They had this bag of wine gums that they kept to give to the pallbearers to keep them sweet on cold days. And just sitting with them, eating their wine gums was one of those sweet moments that you don't expect.
I've just seen the time. We have 15 minutes until the end. Has anyone got any questions? I realise I may have over-prepared, and I've got approximately another 7 hours worth of questions. Has anyone got any questions? Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, there we are. We're going to mic you up.
Wait.
It's that thing, isn't it, that Jerry Seinfeld said that there was a study done on people's greatest fears, and the biggest fear was public speaking, and the second one was death. So if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. So that's what I was dreading. And I'd go, any questions? And I was like, no. Yes.
So first of all, thank you. It's been a fascinating and really moving talk. And something that strikes me is that for such an industry that has a reputation perhaps of being quite gruesome or spooky or cold, or there's actually a lot of love and care and gentleness in the industry, and people really wanting to honour people's lives and emotions, which made me wonder, I guess in your sort of journey of writing this book, from a sort of philosophical or existential perspective, how has your relationship with death changed?
Oh, that's a good one.
Better than yours.
It is. I haven't got that.
Yeah, I feel like I think it's less scary knowing not only what's going to happen, but the kind of people who do this job. And obviously, my book is not, it's not a census. I haven't gone and found out if everyone who works in the industry is nice. But I found that the people who are good at their job and who really love their job are the ones who feel like they're doing something. And they all have this kind of, they're very tender and caring and loving. And everyone I spoke to had like a little thing that they do that they don't see. If I had just spoken to them on Zoom, they would never have brought it up. It was just one of those things that I pointed at behind them, or they did it and I said, what was that? The grave digger, I noticed when he was digging the grave, the soil that came out of the ground was all wet clay. It was very heavy. And he had this little pot of soil that he, that he tucked beside a headstone. And I said, what's that? And he said, oh, that's for the vicar to throw the soil onto the coffin. And I said, but the dirt in there is not the dirt that came out of here, because it was really fine, it was soft. And he goes, they're molehills from my garden, I collect them. They land softer on the coffin, they land like feathers. Whereas the other, if you threw what came out of the grave, it would go thunk, and everyone would go, that's an empty box, or that's a full box. But it's a box, and there's something about the box, the closed box, that freaks people out. So that was just one little caring thing. And I spoke to another funeral director who, he said, a thing that people do when they, when someone in your family dies, there's a point where you have to go and collect clothes for them to be buried or burned in. He said that everybody forgets to bring underwear. And they forget the underwear, they forget the socks. So he always has spares in his office because he just could not live with himself burying people pantsless. But that's important to him. But, would you remember to bring underpants? It's one of those strange that you go, oh, this is the pretty dress she'd want to wear, but yeah, you forget. But yeah, everybody had a little careful, loving thing. But not everybody in the book is nice. I didn't want it to be just, a collection of nice people.
There is one arsehole I wanted to get onto.
I didn't want it to be like this soft, cozy, because people try and, some death books can be a bit, I think, patronizing and soft and, like wrapping you in cotton wool. And that's not what I wanted. Some people who work in death are not nice. And make a point of not being nice. And I met a crime scene cleaner who was just he was very brash and very jokey and very crass. And he was from California, and he got the idea for his job from watching Pulp Fiction and seeing Harvey Keitel do it. And I don't think that's the best way to choose a career. That's what he did. And but in speaking to him, he was the only person who told me he was afraid of death. He was still afraid of death. He had seen the worst that people can do, and his job was to come in and clean up after them. And he wasn't giving anyone the dignity that they deserved, or, he was just making mess disappear. And he was the least okay with death. So.
I've got a comment here from Jerry online saying, thank you for writing this book. It's so wonderfully empathetic. You and Caitlin Doherty have helped me be less afraid of death.
Oh, everyone should read Caitlin's book. It's great. Smoke gets in your eyes.
Steve asks, I suppose I've gone from one there. I should go to the room. Any, yes?
Is there like a moment... Oh, there it is. Is there like a moment where it switches over with working with dead bodies to being a historic working with dead bodies? Because
It's a shout.
You're being censored.
Silenced.
So I work with human remains.
Oh, wow.
Ancient human remains. So I guess is there like a moment where it becomes a different context?
You work with ancient human remains?
Yeah.
Right. Do they have pants?
We'd be lucky if they did. Old cloth is really great
Right.
with textiles.
Yeah. When does? Do you have a minimum age that you like? If you want them to be properly old before you look at them.
Technically, if you ask like the legal, the law part of it, it's about 75 to 100 years because that's when living memory of living relative runs out.
Right.
Wow. For this book, I just wanted to focus on people who did fresh stuff, but I still count you among the death workers. I interviewed the woman who looks after all the skeletons in the Museum of London. Every skeleton that is dug up, when Crossrail was happening, they were coming across skeletons all the time. And she showed me, it was another one of those going to somebody's place of work and saying, can you just show me stuff in boxes? And she was getting skeletons out for me and then explaining the story of their lives through the marks on their bones. And I found it completely fascinating. Like she had a skull out, and she said, well, this guy smoked a pipe. And you could tell there was like whether his teeth were worn. I found it fascinating. I think all of this is fascinating. But she was as caring with those skeletons as these people were freshly dead people. She was carefully putting things away, not just because they would smash, but she kept saying, this gentleman or this lady. And I found it really sweet.
Now I'm scared of the time. This could be a quick one. Steve asks, would you agree that the human race has a 100% death rate? Thus, it is the only true statistic.
Yes.
I'd actually disagree with that because a lot of us are still alive. And there may be exceptions made in some of our cases. Who knows? Anonymous attendee, have you heard about council case workers whose job it is to find the family of relatives of unclaimed bodies?
No, but Lara, who is one of the people I interviewed in the chapter about autopsies, one of her jobs is trying to identify who a person might be and contacting families. And she found it really sad that there would be, like, one of the things that she said was a burden to her in her work was that she knows someone is dead before the families know that someone is dead. And she worked on the London Bridge attacks, and so she was aware, she was seeing missing posters and knowing that that person was in her care. But she felt strange knowing that before, their mum or dad knew that. So someone has to do it.
Another one from the room, I think. Yes. Gentleman down the front. Bring your mic.
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for that. It's been really fascinating. I was just thinking about the last couple of years, and I wondered whether, do you think COVID has done anything to change our relation, as a culture, our relationship or attitudes to death, and if it hasn't, should it have?
Well, I think a lot of people are more screwed up now because lots of people were seeing death for the first time, and like Poppy said, the first dead body you see should not be someone you love. That was the case for many people if they got to see the body at all. And I think seeing the body is hugely important, as is having the funeral. And people weren't allowed to mourn and have these traditional, celebrations, parties, that they would ordinarily do. So there is this open-ended grief that is still occurring. And I think it's a huge problem. No one is really talking about it. I think the fact that the government is saying COVID is over, move on. I think a lot of people are feeling left behind. I don't think pretending the pandemic isn't still happening. I don't think that is helping people who have lost people, because how can you pretend the last 2 years haven't happened? And having, this book, I couldn't do this book now because so many more restrictions are in place now. I wouldn't have been allowed in the autopsy room during COVID. They would have been too busy to talk to me anyway. There are different rules about where you can be. And so this is a kind of snapshot of what death was like just before it became the main thing that was happening. And when COVID was happening, I was picturing all of these people I knew and had been with who were overworked anyway. And I was picturing what they were doing. And I was still in touch with some of them. Lara, who did the autopsies, she was being put up in a hotel across the road from the hospital where she worked because she was on call all the time. Everybody was overworked. So I think we probably have a huge mental health crisis coming that is grief-based. There are lots of reasons why lots of people are screwed up, but a grief-based one is, I think it's our generation's thing. It's coming.
Anonymous attendee has said, excellent informative discussion, thank you. Did any of the workers you talked to have an opinion about large corporations taking over the funeral industry by buying up hundreds of local funeral homes? This is especially true in North America as the industry becomes more and more profit-oriented. Says Anonymous, but I think we can safely assume it's the ghost of Jessica Mitford.
All of them talked about the business of death and how things are being taken away from them and huge corporations are ruining everything. It's the same in every industry. So death is no different.
Death is no different. Ralph and Karen Anthony asked, did you find people in the death industry more or less superstitious than average folks?
No different, really. There was the gravedigger who was frightened of the cemetery at night. He just would not be caught there.
And he's got...
I thought that was funny.
And he's getting buried with his mother.
The thing about the gravediggers is they've both dug their own graves already because both of their mothers have died and they want to go in the same grave as their mothers. So they helped each other dig their mother's graves. And so they know where they're going to be. And I said, is that weird? I kept saying, is that strange? And they kept looking at me like, why would that be weird? Like, we all end up somewhere, and we just know where. And I said, but you've already been in it. And but they saw it as something comforting. They were going back to their mothers, even though one of them was a bit frightened that he'd have to be in the cemetery at night. He said his mum would take care of him. He was sweet.
And you ate his wine gums. I think we're down to the last minute. Anyone in the room? Yes. I'm not sure if are we going to trust it? Let's give it a go. Oh, it works. Yeah, it's like 4 on there, but we've got literally 1.5 minutes.
Talk. I just wondered, with all that research concerning death, has your appreciation for the living increased?
Some of them. I have a huge appreciation for the people who do the jobs that all of us are too frightened to do, or think that we couldn't. I think that there is probably a strength in all of us that we haven't looked at yet. And if you are frightened of dead bodies, I'd say go and see one and see if that's true, because I don't think they're frightening. But yeah, I have a huge appreciation for key workers and people who make things work while writers like me sit at home. But I have no more love for politicians and things.
What a joyful note to end on, I think. I do apologise for the people online. I wonder if there's a way. I've just had the nod that we've hit our limit, so I wonder if there's any way we can answer these in text to them afterwards, maybe. But other than that, can we have a huge round of applause for Hayley Campbell? I was also supposed to say, if you would like a copy of this book and you're watching online, they are available from independent booksellers, Fox Lane Books at foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. And for those of you in person here today, there's only one. So fight over it. No, there's a few out there. And I think you're going to do a sign.
Yeah, I'll scribble in them if you want.
Yeah, and then maybe we'll look at getting back to those, but we have hit our time. Thank you so much for coming tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.